was the nurse the first 3-4 nights. She came out one night. She's like, "Oh, that Tupac of yours, he's a fighter." I'm like, "What happened?" He's like, "We almost lost him, gave him 500 cc's and whatever, and came right back too." But then she said that he was in an induced coma because each time.
For nearly 30 years, the world believed they knew how Tupac Shakur died. The shooting, the hospital, the 6 days of hope that ended in tragedy. But newly discovered medical records are changing that story, revealing details that were never meant to be seen. What if the bullets were not what killed him? What if the real story happened behind closed doors, where no one was allowed to ask questions? Join us as we uncover the documents that suggest Tupac's death was not what we were told. A patient who lived when he was not expected. 2. The white Cadillac disappeared into the Las Vegas night after firing 13 shots, 4 of them tearing through Tupac Shakur's body as he sat in the passenger seat of a black BMW. The damage was catastrophic. Bullets had ripped through his chest, pierced his lung, and caused massive internal bleeding. By the time he arrived at University Medical Center, most people would have assumed his fate was already sealed. But Tupac survived the initial trauma, and that survival may have been the most dangerous thing that happened that night. Emergency room doctors worked frantically to stabilize him. His blood pressure was dropping, his breathing was shallow, and the internal damage was severe. They rushed him into surgery, a procedure that would last for hours as surgeons fought to repair what the bullets had destroyed. 1 lung was removed entirely, 2 damaged to save, and the blood loss alone should have killed him. The trauma to his organs should have ended everything right there on the operating table, but it didn't. Tupac made it through the surgery alive. For the first few hours after the operation, his heart kept beating, his remaining lung kept functioning, and his body held on despite the odds. Medical staff noted that his condition was critical but stable, a phrase that suggests someone clinging to life but not yet slipping away. According to reports, there were even moments where doctors saw signs that made them cautiously optimistic. His vitals responded to treatment, his body showed resilience, and for a brief window it seemed possible he might pull through. This created a problem that no one talks about openly, but the conspiracy theory suggests it was a problem nonetheless. A dead Tupac was a tragedy, a headline, a moment of grief that would eventually fade. But a living Tupac was something else entirely. He was a witness, he was a voice, he was someone who could speak about what happened that night and everything that led up to it. If Tupac woke up, he could name names, he could describe threats he had received, he could expose the environment of fear and control that surrounded death row records. He could talk about security decisions that left him vulnerable, about people who may have wanted him silenced, about pressures and conflicts that had been building for months. His survival meant unpredictability. It meant lawsuits. It meant testimony. It meant a voice that could not be controlled. A dead man tells no story. He becomes a memory, a legend, someone the world mourns and then moves on from. A living man can change everything. He can disrupt carefully constructed narratives. He can point investigators in directions they weren't supposed to look. He can become the single most dangerous person in a room full of secrets. Investigators looking back at the case began to consider something disturbing. What if Tupac's survival in that operating room was never part of the plan? What if the people who wanted him gone had expected the shooting to finish the job? And what if his resilience in those first critical hours created a crisis that required a different solution? But surviving surgery was only the beginning, because what happened next would take away the one thing that made Tupac dangerous, his ability to speak. The coma that changed control. Within hours of the surgery, doctors made a decision that would define everything that followed. They placed Tupac into a medically induced coma. The official explanation was straightforward and made perfect sense from a medical standpoint. His body had endured massive trauma. His organs needed time to recover without the stress of consciousness, and the coma would reduce pain while giving his system the best possible chance to heal. But some theory points to something else that a medically induced coma accomplishes. It removes all agency from the patient. It silences them completely, and it places total control into the hands of those around them. From the moment Tupac was put under, he could no longer speak. He could no longer make decisions about his own care. He could no longer tell anyone what he remembered or who he suspected. He became entirely dependent on the medical staff treating him, on the family members visiting him, and on the people controlling access to his room. Everything that happened to him from that point forward would be decided by others, and he would have no say in any of it. Medical professionals will explain that induced comas are standard procedure for severe trauma cases, that they serve a legitimate and necessary purpose, and that there was nothing suspicious about this decision. The conspiracy does not dispute the medical reasoning. It simply asks what else that decision enabled, who benefited from Tupac being unable to communicate, and whether the coma created opportunities that would not have existed if he had remained conscious. Investigators familiar with the investigation began to notice how the coma changed the dynamics of everything. Visitors were controlled, access was limited, and information about his condition became filtered through a small number of people. The public received updates that were hopeful but vague. His mother, Afeni, spoke to the media with cautious optimism, and the world waited for news of his recovery. But inside that hospital room, Tupac had no voice, no ability to advocate for himself, and no way to influence what was happening to his own body. This silence was convenient for people who had reasons to want him gone, because a patient in a coma cannot testify, cannot expose secrets, cannot make phone calls or give statements. They exist in a state of suspended vulnerability, alive but powerless, present but absent. If someone wanted to ensure Tupac never spoke about what happened that night, a medically induced coma accomplished that goal without requiring any overtly criminal act. It also created a window of time where decisions about his care could be made without his input, where the trajectory of his recovery could be influenced by choices he would never know about, and where the line between legitimate medical judgment and something darker could become impossible to distinguish. The coma did not end Tupac's life, but it may have made it easier for those who wanted him dead to ensure he never woke up. And as the days passed and the public remained hopeful, something strange was happening with the medical records. Details that should have been clear were missing, and the story being told outside the hospital did not match what was happening inside. The records that do not explain enough. When medical records from Tupac's hospital stay were finally discovered and examined years later, investigators expected them to provide clarity about what happened during those 6 critical days. Instead, the documents raised more questions than they answered, and what made them suspicious was not what they revealed, but what they left out. For a patient as high profile as Tupac Shakur, someone whose condition was being monitored by the world, the level of detail in the medical documentation felt surprisingly thin. There were gaps in the timeline, hours where little was noted about his status or treatment, and moments where his condition changed dramatically without clear explanation of why. Phil Carson and others who reviewed the records noticed these absences immediately. Because in cases involving celebrities or potential criminal victims, hospitals typically document everything with extreme care to protect themselves legally. But these records seemed different. They contained the basics of what happened, but avoided the deeper details that would explain critical decisions. When did doctors first become concerned about his chances? What specific complications arose and when? Who authorized certain treatments or changes in care? And why were some interventions attempted while others were not? The answers to these questions were either vague or missing entirely. This lack of detail is evidence that something was being hidden, not necessarily through deliberate destruction of records, but through careful avoidance of creating them in the first place. If decisions were being made that could not withstand scrutiny, the safest approach would be to simply not document them thoroughly. No detailed notes means no paper trail means no accountability, and no accountability means questions that can never be definitively answered. What made it more troubling was that certain key moments in Tupac's decline were barely explained at all. His condition would reportedly worsen suddenly, his vitals would become unstable, and complications would arise that pushed him closer to death. But the records did not always explain what triggered these changes, whether they were expected consequences of his injuries or something else entirely. For investigators trying to understand whether Tupac received the best possible care, or whether his decline was allowed or even encouraged, these gaps made it impossible to know for certain. The newly surfaced documents were not shocking because they proved wrongdoing. They were shocking because they failed to prove anything at all. They left room for doubt, for suspicion, for theories that could never be fully dismissed because the evidence needed to dismiss them simply was not there. But while the public was being told that Tupac was fighting and had reason to hope, people inside the hospital were witnessing something very different. The decline that did not match the public story. Outside University Medical Center, the narrative being shared with the world was one of cautious optimism and fighting spirit. Tupac's family spoke to reporters about his strength, his will to survive, and the possibility that he might pull through. Fans gathered outside the hospital, praying, hoping, and believing that their hero would defy the odds. The media reported updates that suggested he was battling his injuries but had not given up. Inside the hospital, the reality was far grimmer and had been from the beginning. Medical staff reportedly knew within the first 24 hours that Tupac's chances were extremely poor. The damage to his body was too severe. The complications were mounting faster than they could address them, and his organs were struggling under the strain. Breathing complications arose repeatedly. His remaining lung wasn't functioning well enough to sustain him long term, and the stress on his heart and other vital systems was unsustainable. Each crisis was met with intervention, but the interventions were becoming less effective as time went on. This disconnect between the public story and the private reality was deliberate. That maintaining hope outside the hospital served a purpose. It bought time, it controlled the narrative, it kept the media focused on recovery rather than asking harder questions about what led to the shooting in the first place. As long as people believed Tupac might survive, attention stayed on his condition rather than on the people who may have wanted him dead. Phil Carson and others examining the case later found this pattern deeply suspicious because hope can be a form of misdirection. While the world watched and waited, decisions were being made inside that hospital room that would determine whether Tupac lived or died. Those decisions were being made by doctors, by family, and potentially by others who had access and influence. The public optimism created a buffer, a protective layer that kept scrutiny away during the most critical window. By the time the truth became undeniable, by the time it was clear that Tupac would not recover, the moment had passed. The investigation into the shooting had already begun to lose momentum. Witnesses were already disappearing or refusing to talk, and the narrative about gang retaliation was already taking hold. When Tupac finally died on September the 13th, the world mourned. But the questions that should have been asked in those first days were already buried under a story that had been carefully constructed. And somewhere in those 6 days, the theory claims a shift occurred that was almost invisible, but absolutely critical. The goal was no longer saving Tupac's life. The moment the goal changed, there is a point in every critical medical case where doctors must make a choice between aggressive intervention and acceptance of realities, where they decide whether to keep fighting or to acknowledge that survival is no longer possible. For most patients, this moment comes after every reasonable option has been exhausted, after multiple attempts to stabilize have failed, and after it becomes clear that further treatment would only prolong suffering without changing the outcome. The record suggests that with Tupac, this moment came earlier than it should have, and that the shift from fighting for his life to accepting his death was not purely a medical decision. Phil Carson and others who examined the timeline noticed something unsettling about how quickly the focus seemed to change. In the first day or two after surgery, there were reports of aggressive treatment, attempts to stabilize his breathing, efforts to manage complications, and interventions designed to give his body the best chance to recover. But somewhere around the third or fourth day, according to the theory, the intensity of care began to diminish. Not in dramatic ways, not through obvious neglect, but through subtle changes in approach that suggested the priority had shifted. Life support decisions became more conservative. Certain interventions that might have been attempted were not pursued, and the medical team seemed to move toward managing his decline rather than preventing it. The conspiracy does not claim that doctors actively harmed Tupac, or that anyone made a single fatal decision that ended his life. Instead, it suggests something more insidious, that a series of small choices, each individually defensible, collectively ensured that he would not survive. This is what makes the theory so disturbing, because it does not require unaliving the victim in any traditional sense. It does not need a villain who injects poison or cuts off oxygen. It only requires a quiet decision that survival is no longer the priority, that the complications are too severe, that the chances are too slim, and that allowing nature to take its course is the most reasonable path forward. In a medical setting, these decisions happen every day, and they are often the right choice for patients who genuinely have no hope of recovery. But what if Tupac did have a chance? What if his body could have fought through with more aggressive treatment? What if the shift toward acceptance came not because recovery was impossible, but because his survival had become inconvenient? The theory asks whether medical judgment was influenced by factors that had nothing to do with his health. whether pressure came from people who had reasons to want him gone, and whether the hospital became the place where a problem that began on the streets of Las Vegas was quietly finished. There would be no crime scene, no weapon, no suspects to chase, just a young man who died from complications related to gunshot wounds, a tragic outcome that no one could question. The investigation could close, the media could move on, and the people who benefited from his silence could continue their lives without fear of exposure. Tupac would become a martyr, a legend, a symbol, but he would never be a witness. And once the decision was made, whether consciously or unconsciously, all that remained was to wait for the inevitable. While outside the hospital, the world prepared to mourn a man who may have been allowed to die. Why? This was never fully investigated. When Tupac Shakur died on September 13, 1996, the official cause of death was respiratory failure and cardiopulmonary arrest due to gunshot wounds. It was a conclusion that made perfect sense on the surface. He had been shot multiple times, had undergone major surgery, had suffered severe complications, and his body had ultimately given out. The medical examiner's report was straightforward. The death certificate was signed, and the case was closed from a medical standpoint. This is precisely why the theory was never seriously investigated, because a complex medical death is far easier to accept and move past than a public execution. Phil Carson understood this dynamic well from his years in law enforcement, that deaths occurring in hospitals under medical supervision rarely trigger the same level of scrutiny as deaths on the street. There is an assumption of legitimacy, a trust that doctors did everything they could, and an acceptance that sometimes, despite best efforts, patients simply do not survive. Questioning medical decisions requires expert review, access to detailed records, and a willingness to challenge professionals who are generally given the benefit of the doubt. In Tupac's case, there was no immediate reason for investigators to suspect anything wrong with his hospital care. The focus was entirely on finding who shot him, not on examining whether he received appropriate treatment afterward. The shooting itself provided a clear and sufficient explanation for his death. So, why would anyone look deeper into what happened during those 6 days? The doctors had tried to save him. They had performed surgery. They had placed him in a coma to help recovery. And ultimately, his injuries were too severe. It was a tragedy, but it was a medically explainable tragedy. This is exactly what makes the theory so difficult to prove or disprove, because the absence of investigation means the absence of evidence either way. If no one ever looked closely at the medical decisions, at the Gazin documentation, at the timeline of his decline, then there is nothing to definitively prove wrongdoing, but also nothing to definitively rule it out. The case exists in a space of permanent uncertainty, where suspicion can never be confirmed, but also never be fully dismissed. This ambiguity was not accidental, but beneficial to those who wanted Tupac silenced, because a death that occurs in a hospital under medical care does not create the same pressure for answers as a death that looks like murder. There is no crime scene to preserve, no suspects to interrogate, no courtroom drama to worry about. The world mourns, the industry moves on, the pressure dissolves, and the truth becomes paperwork that gets sealed and filed away. Until decades later, when someone finally asks the question that should have been asked from the beginning, if the shooting was only meant to put Tupac in the hospital, then what really ended his story inside those walls? And if this theory holds any truth, then the real conspiracy was not in the bullets fired that night, but in the silence that followed, and in the system that made sure no one would ever look closely enough to see what really happened. The system that protects itself. Phil Carson had spent decades inside the machinery of law enforcement, and he understood something that most people outside the system never fully grasp: that institutions are designed above all else to protect themselves. Not out of malice necessarily, but out of survival instinct, out of the need to maintain credibility, to avoid scandal, to preserve the trust that allows them to function. When that self-protection conflicts with the pursuit of truth, the truth often loses. In the case of Tupac's death, multiple systems had reasons to avoid digging too deeply into what happened at University Medical Center. The hospital needed to protect its reputation, to avoid malpractice accusations, to ensure that no one questioned the quality of care provided to one of the most famous patients they had ever treated. Law enforcement needed to focus on the shooting itself, on finding the gunman, on solving what appeared to be a straightforward gang-related murder. The music industry needed to move forward, to manage the aftermath, to control the narrative in ways that minimize damage to profitable business relationships. None of these institutions necessarily conspired together, but they all had incentives that aligned in the same direction, toward accepting the official story and not asking uncomfortable questions. The hospital had no reason to invite scrutiny of its medical decisions. Investigators had no reason to second-guess doctors who were presumed to have done their best, and the industry had no reason to keep attention focused on a tragedy when moving on was more profitable. No one wanted to be the person who accused a hospital of letting Tupac die. No one wanted to be the investigator who suggested doctors might have been influenced by outside pressure. And no one wanted to be the journalist who questioned whether the medical care was as aggressive as it should have been. The social and professional costs of making those accusations were high, and the likelihood of proving them was low, so silence became the easier path. In Tupac's case, questioning what happened in the hospital would have required challenging medical professionals, obtaining expert testimony, fighting for access to sealed records, and potentially accusing respected institutions of negligence or worse. It would have been messy, controversial, and uncertain, with a high probability of failure and significant damage to careers and reputations along the way. Accepting that he died from his gunshot wounds was simpler, cleaner, and allowed everyone to move forward without the complications that deeper investigation would bring. This does not claim that everyone involved was corrupt or complicit. It claims something more disturbing, that good people working within systems designed to protect those systems will often choose institutional stability over uncomfortable truth, and that this choice happens so naturally, so automatically, that most people do not even recognize they are making it. But beyond institutional self-protection, there was another force at work, the simple fact that some truths are more dangerous than others, and that silence can become a survival strategy for everyone involved. On the silence that became survival. In the weeks and months after Tupac's death, a pattern emerged that Phil Carson and other investigators found deeply troubling. People who had been close to the situation, who had information about what happened, who could have provided answers, chose silence instead. Not because they were threatened necessarily, though some certainly were, but because they recognized that speaking carried risks that silence did not. Doctors and nurses who treated Tupac at University Medical Center never spoke publicly about the details of his care beyond official statements. They did not give interviews, they did not write memoirs, they did not share their experiences even decades later, when doing so might have seemed safe. This silence was not just about patient privacy or professional ethics. It was about self-preservation, about recognizing that questioning the official narrative of his death could invite scrutiny of their own decisions and actions. Family members who were present during those 6 days have shared some memories, but have largely kept the most painful details private. Tupac Shakur, Tupac's mother, rarely discussed specifics about his final hours, about conversations with doctors, about decisions that had to be made regarding his care. She carried that grief privately, and the theory asks whether that privacy was purely personal, or whether it also reflected an understanding that certain truths were better left unspoken. People within death row records who might have known about pressures or influences being applied during Tupac's hospitalization also remained largely silent. Some died under suspicious circumstances, others disappeared from public life, and those who survived learned that talking about death row's inner workings could be dangerous. The wall of silence that had made investigating the shooting so difficult extended to everything that happened afterward, including what occurred in that hospital. Carson recognized this pattern from other cases involving powerful interests and institutional failures. That silence spreads like a disease when people see what happens to those who speak out. Witnesses who talked found themselves isolated, questioned, sometimes threatened, while those who stayed quiet were left alone. The lesson was clear: cooperation brought consequences, silence brought safety. And over time, that calculation became automatic for anyone who knew anything. What made Tupac's case particularly insidious was that the silence was not enforced by a single person or organization, but maintained by a collective understanding that certain questions should not be asked. Doctors stayed silent to protect their careers and reputations. Family members stayed silent to protect their grief and privacy. Industry insiders stayed silent to protect their lives and livelihoods. And investigators stayed silent because they were told to, or because they recognized that pursuing certain leads would end their careers. This widespread silence was not coincidental, but necessary. because the truth about what happened to Tupac required so many people to be complicit, either actively or passively, that exposing it would have implicated institutions and individuals far beyond whoever pulled the trigger. If Tupac was allowed to die in that hospital, if his care was influenced by people who wanted him silenced, if medical decisions were made based on factors other than his health, then proving it would require doctors to admit failure, hospitals to accept liability, law enforcement to acknowledge they missed it, and powerful people to face consequences. The cost of truth was simply too high for too many people, so silence became the only rational choice for everyone involved. And that silence has lasted for nearly 3 decades, protecting secrets that may never be fully revealed. And so, the question remains, not whether Tupac could have survived, but whether he was ever truly meant to, and whether the bullets fired that night were just the beginning of a plan that ended quietly in a hospital room where no one was watching closely enough to see. The pattern of silence. Tupac's hospital records may be shocking on their own, but when compared to other high-profile cases, a pattern begins to emerge. Celebrities and public figures who survived near-fatal injuries often have stories that end strangely once they enter medical care. Consider Michael Jackson's final days. Medical details were disputed. Conflicting reports filled the press, and key timelines remain unclear. Or Princess Diana, after the crash, certain medical decisions and delays sparked years of questions about what truly happened in the hospital. Even modern whistleblowers or political figures who fall critically ill sometimes vanish from public scrutiny, only for their records to be partially released decades later. In Tupac's case, the new documents follow a similar structure. Missing explanations, thin notes at critical hours, and decisions that silently shape the outcome. The difference is that Tupac's case is frozen in the collective imagination of millions of fans, creating a pressure cooker where every gap in the story fuels speculation. The theory does not require conspirators in dark rooms, only systems, timing, and selective disclosure. Hospital silence is a recurring tool, a quiet method to control narratives, manage reputations, and sometimes protect secrets. Tupac's night becomes not just a story of injury and survival, but a mirror to a wider phenomenon. When the world waits outside hospital doors, what happens inside is often hidden, curated, and preserved for decades before anyone sees it. If this pattern exists again and again, could Tupac's story be just one chapter in a larger, unspoken rule of how power manages the vulnerable?